On behalf of the National Gallery of Modern Art, Bengaluru, Ministry of Culture, Government of India, and in collaboration with Intech Bengaluru, I warmly welcome you all for today's lecture, The Curse of Copper and the Goddesses of Technology, Mobility, Value, and Metallurgy in Early Modern South Asia. We are delighted to have with us Dr. Eric Gurevitch, a historian of science, technology, and medicine, specializing in the medieval and early modern periods. We are honored to host Dr. Eric and grateful to all of you for joining us this evening. To introduce Mr. Eric and his talk today, I would like to invite Ms. Meera Iyer on stage from Intech.
Thank you. Before I introduce Eric, I'd also like to give a little bit of an introduction to INTAC. So most of you probably know that INTAC stands for the Indian National Trust for Art and Cultural Heritage. We are a non-governmental organization that was established in 1984 in Delhi. And since that time, more than 40 years ago, we now have more than 220 chapters at last count all around the country. And we are focused on promoting awareness about heritage, about history, and also conservation. Our chapter in Bangalore, I'm the convener of the Bangalore chapter. Our chapter in Bangalore, largely we work in two broad areas. One is outreach and one is conservation of heritage. So when we come to outreach, one of the things that we work on, which we have been working on for the last few years, is talking about local history, people and organizations around Bangalore. We have also been conducting heritage walks around the city, and these walks cover architecture, nature, culture. Of course, because we are the Bangalore chapter, our publications are focused on the city. Some of them are about the city, about the local heritage that you find in the streets and neighborhoods. And then there's also a book which is targeting children, which is like historical fiction set in the city of Bangalore. So a nice way to have children get interested in the city and its stories. We also have an interactive website about the Someshwara temple in Alsur. And again, this is something that we hope we'll be able to do for more of the structures around the city, where you can go to this website and you get to know more about the architecture, the sculptures, the stories in the temples, and so on. And of course, a very important part of our outreach is events such as this, where we have talks. We also conduct a number of different workshops, both online and in-person workshops. So, and these are free for, they're open to anybody. Because our aim is really, we're not restricting these things to only students. So these are open to anybody to join. In terms of conservation, one of the projects that we have just recently finished, and so it's like uppermost in my mind now, is we restored these 4 very cute, small little railway stations, which you will pass a couple of them when you're going to the airport. There's Torjala and there's Devanahalli. And there's this little station, which is Avatihalli, which is just about 6 kilometers beyond Devanahalli. And this recently, just last month, we opened a small little museum in the restored building, which talks about how silk is made in the areas around there. So please go take a look sometime. This is Nandi Halt Station, which is currently, it's already been restored. This is an older picture. Some of the other restoration works that we've done around the city. This is All Saints Church. And this is the Bangalore Club, where we have finished the first phase of restoration, and we are beginning with the second phase of restoration. There are a whole bunch of other buildings that we have restored around the city. I don't want to provide you with an entire list, but amongst other things that we do is also document heritage around the city. Sometimes things which are not noticed. So for example, a couple of years ago, we did this documenting of Kalyanis around the city, stepwells around the city. And when we started, we thought there must be 4 or 5. Turns out there were more than 20. We also had another project a little earlier where we documented board games around the temples in Bangalore. And again, like it was really surprising to us how many of these little bits of everyday heritage are still there, and we walk on them routinely without even noticing them. So we did this a few years ago. We mapped the locations in the temples where they are located and so on and so forth. One of the other things I will just briefly touch upon is a recent thing again, a recent event. This is Devraj Market in Mysore. And I think many of you will know that there was the Mysore City Corporation wanted to demolish this building and rebuild it, either in heritage style or build a new building, some plans they had. So there was a PIL, a public interest litigation, saying that it should not be demolished. And as part of this case eventually went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court impleaded intact, which meant, and they asked us to provide a comprehensive report on the structural condition of the building, of Devraj Market and of Lansdowne Bazaar, which is nearby. So we submitted this to the Supreme Court in September. And in, again, a month or so ago, the Supreme Court decided, has given an order saying that this building and Lansdowne should both be restored and protected. Yeah, we were also very happy. And again, this is, I'm sure many of you already know this, but the Hoysala temples, especially Belur, particularly Belur Halebeedu, the temples in Belur Halebeedu and Somnathpura were declared UNESCO World Heritage Sites in September 2023. This was something that we had worked on. This was a project that was given to us by the government of Karnataka, and we spent about 3 years working on these temples, visiting not just these 3, but several other temples, trying to understand their architecture, their sculpture, their history. And eventually we, after several meetings, both local meetings with local stakeholders, meetings with the Archaeological Survey of India, and so on and so forth, eventually this was submitted in Jan 2022. And then 2023, it was declared WHS. So a lot of our work, not all of it, a lot of our work is only possible thanks to donations from people and the support that people like you give by turning up and showing so much interest. So thank you all. With that, I will move over to introducing Eric, who is going to be speaking today about some of the work that he has done in Western India. So Eric is an assistant professor. He studies the history of technology, and he's in the Department of the History of Science at Harvard University. He's been working in India for almost 15 years, and he's been all over the place. Like, he's been to so many different parts of the country. His research interests are primarily in the history of science, technology, and medicine, especially in medieval and early modern South Asia. So he has a book, which I'm really looking forward to. It's due to come out next year, and it's titled Everyday Sciences, Practical Knowledge and Knowledgeable Practice in Medieval South Asia. And in this, he documents the rise of vernacular sciences and about how, like, people took to writing to describe practices like predicting the weather, assaying gold, and healing poisons. So this is something really exciting. Today, as I said, he's going to be speaking about some of his work in Western India. So, Eric.
Okay, perfect. Wow. So can people hear me? Is this, I'm not going to stand exactly behind the podium. And I'm really just, I'm thrilled to be here and thinking aloud with so many friends, both old and new. And I would like to particularly thank Samira Sheikh, Mira Iyer, who you just heard from, and Venkat Srinivasan for putting together the work to make all of this happen. I don't really know, a lot went on behind the scenes, and we were, I just sent a few emails and you all did so much. So thank you, and thank you to Intouch and the NGMA for hosting this. It's great to be here. As you've heard just now, I am a historian of science and technology, which means that as my day job, I teach big overview courses about surveys about the last 1,000 years of technologies, as well as smaller courses about topics such as the cultural history of worries over machines. My research focuses on South Asia, an area that we are trying to build up in the History of Science department at Harvard. And I tend to think that the histories of science and technology that we tell, our received ones, have been a little too limited in their scope. So this evening, I will present some materials related to metallurgy and artisan ingenuity that I've been thinking with recently. And each step of the way, I will draw on sources that relate to copper and its alloys, brass and bronze. Tomorrow, if anyone in this room is not tired of hearing from me, I will give a different talk, one focused more on Karnataka at the Mythic Society. In general tonight, I'll try to answer 3 broad questions, and I want you to keep these in the back of your head for the next 45 minutes or so. First, who is included in the stories we tell about technology and its history? Then, what sources do we use to tell our histories? And finally, why should anybody care? I will be talking about artisans and mechanics, architects in early modern South Asia, so roughly 1450 of the Common Era until, let's say, 1700. This was a time of immense intercultural exchange and transformations in technology, both in terms of everyday and everyday and elite life were in many ways restructured around new technologies, sometimes biotechnologies, sometimes chemical ones, sometimes mechanical ones. But to get into this early modern material, I'll start with the story from just a few months ago, when something rather strange happened. Here it is. The Central Bank of Sweden gave the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economics to a historian, Joel Moker. He got half the prize money, and then these 2 more conventional economists split the other half. So this never happens. It's very strange. Nobody in policy circles listens to historians. Even stranger, I should say, okay, we'll be picking a few fights at the start of this, okay? So even stranger, Moker is an economic historian interested in the sorts of things that I write about and I'm interested in: science, technology, and the world before industrialization. Now, as you see here on the screen, Moker was awarded the prize for having identified the prerequisites for sustained growth through technological progress. A very big discovery, if true, and one that gets people's attention. So, for instance, in the Indian Express, one significant commentator saw in Moker's writings a lesson for India. On the other hand, a slightly more reserved editorial in the Hindu was more skeptical. Moker's project is, in short, to explain why in the 18th and 19th centuries, Europe grew rich and Asia did not. And his answer is that sustained economic growth depends on a few people being incentivized to make big changes. So he said at his acceptance speech, quote, scientific and technological advances are not made by the population at large. Rather, these are advances made by the smartest, most creative people in society who come up with the ideas, and the vast bulk of people just watch, and maybe they carry out the ideas. So I, on the other hand, would prefer if we didn't dismiss most of humanity from the get-go. To just dive into it just a little bit more, in a series of books written over the course of his career, Mokyr has argued that such individuals come into being when there is a social contact between knowers and doers. So far, so good, which leads to the possibility of creating useful knowledge. However, he argues this can and often does fail. Any society in which a social and linguistic chasm exists between workers, artisans, and engineers on the one side and natural philosophers and scientists on the other will have difficulty, he says, mapping continuously from useful knowledge onto the set of recipes and techniques that increase economic welfare. So one example for Mokyr of a society in which such a chasm existed is traditional India, where there is no organization for the propagation and dissemination of knowledge, and an unbridgeable gap, social barrier existed between theorists and craftsmen. Now, statements like this make my job teaching the history of technology on a global scale difficult, or at least frustrating. And I don't want to spend this evening getting into the weeds with my colleague from Evanston. There are too many things missing from his story, things like war and slavery, to allow it to make it really all that interesting. And over the course of my talk, I will in fact be speaking about lots of ways in which artisans in early modern South Asia were excluded and dismissed by other intellectuals and other groups in society. But posing this set of questions, these assumptions from the start, namely that artisans and engineers outside of Europe were illiterate, devoid of theoretical knowledge, not knowers in their own right, prevents economic historians from bothering to slow down, stop, and listen to people who make a living with their hands. So I want to start this evening with a different assumption. What if we took it as a given that the mass of people with technical knowledge were important for the history of technology? What if we started from their words and allowed our stories of technology to follow from them? In the course of writing my first book, which you heard about and which will be published here with Permanent Black, the first book is about the medieval period. Today I'll be talking about the early modern. I had what may seem like a rather banal realization. And that was this, of course, that South Asia is covered in inscriptions. As we know, it's maybe the most densely inscribed piece of real estate in the world. And whether written in stone or copper plates, records such as these describe the everyday functioning of the medieval state. So the granting of tax remissions, the terms of property transfers, and the construction and maintenance of agrarian hydraulic infrastructure projects. And this was sort of the realization, if you need a stone engraved or a copper plate incised, you call a stonemason or a coppersmith. This meant that for some masons and some smiths, access to the written word was not merely a nicety, it was a necessary part of their professional life. And it turns out such artisans would use their literacy to make claims about their place in society. So take, for instance, these copper plate inscriptions on the screen from about 800 or 900 years ago. These ones are nice. They're written in these big, clear, block Nagari script characters, and each is adorned with a little charming cartouche of Lakshmi and two elephants being showering her. So they're nice, but they're not all that exceptional. What drew me to these is not so much how they look or what they describe, but rather the fact that they were part of a series of copper plate inscriptions inscribed by a man named Palhana, who worked for the Chandela state. And as a stroke of good luck for the historian, Palhana signed each copper plate that he transcribed, so there is his signature. And across his career, he used a changing set of titles to describe his occupation and his place in the world. So these titles allow us to think about the multiple technical identities that artisans were coming to inhabit as they reconceptualized the relationship between craft, technique, and scholarship in the medieval period. The earliest copper plate we have, engraved by Palhana, comes from 1166. This copper plate concludes by stating that it was engraved by Palhana, the coppersmith. He would continue to work with the chancellery in the years to come, and his titles would get somewhat grander. 5 years later, Palhana now concluded his inscriptions with a chaste Sanskrit verse in which he compared his skill to the god Vishwakarma and called himself here just an artisan. He would continue to use this verse for engravings in 1176 and 1178. In the intervening years, he would also refer to himself as Palhana, the scholar. Now, what did it mean for Palhana to go on from calling himself a coppersmith to calling himself a scholar, while continuing all throughout to call himself an artisan? Were artisans and architects reading and writing in this period? What relation did technical knowledge have with practice? Did writing extend from documents, such as the inscriptions that we saw before, to full-blown written texts and manuals? These are basic questions, I should say, but they are important and not asked enough. And it's here that I want to move into the early modern materials that I promised at the start. We'll be jumping between the medieval and the early modern. So to answer the questions in short that I just posed, yes. And to think through this answer, we can turn to the corpus of texts known as Vastu and Shilpa Shastras, right, architectural and craft manuals. I must admit, I for a long time avoided looking into this sort of text. I had for a long time thought they were rather boring. These architectural texts written in Sanskrit tend to be highly schematic. They largely describe the proportions of temples and the nomenclature of different temple components. This is fine for the art historian, but I'm not an art historian, not a very good one at least. And rather than being interested in the products of construction, I'm much more interested in the process of construction. Even harder for the historian, these texts can be difficult to contextualize. So they tend to be either anonymous or attributed to gods or divine sages. But starting in the late medieval period, first as a trickle and then more and more into the early modern, we begin to see Vastu and Shilpa Shastra texts attributed to individuals. As the eminent art historian Madhusudhan Taki put it in a rather hard to find article, the authors and compilers of Vastu texts cast off the disguise of the dialogue form of writing and openly came forward with the admission of their own authorship. And it was these texts that got my attention because they offer the possibility of tracing the emergence of a new model for an artisan or architect author, someone crossing the realms of theory and practice. And as in the earlier inscriptions that I mentioned a minute ago, these architectural manuals were vehicles by which artisans asserted their place, that is, their values in society. So I'll just, to reiterate, people who attach the titles artisan or architect, that is Sutradhara and Shilpi, to their names, began to claim authorship for manuals in this period. This was not just a one-time occurrence. Here I've put about 10 on the screen, 10 authors who use these appellations. And some of these authors composed multiple texts. So we have texts authored by people such as Sutradhara Virapala, Sutradhara Mala, son of Shilpi Nakula, and Udgata Ramachandra, student of Shilpi Madhava Bhatta. Most prominent in this group, and here I've put him at the top, is a group of artisan architect authors writing in 15th century Mewar, centered around one Sutradhara Mandana. So who was Sutradhara Mandana? He was a prolific architect, author of the 15th century, who was associated with Rana Kumbhakarna of Chittor, And the texts he authored were copied and circulated widely. So manuscript copies of his works, some with regional language commentaries, survive in the dozens and are distributed in libraries across South Asia. Here's how he describes himself in the end of some of his works. He describes himself here, as I've said, as an inhabitant of Mewar. He's a part of this architectural family. He's taken on this term, architect, as a part of his name, as an epithet, and he is a servant of Rana Kumbhakar. And while today he is mostly associated with stone and temple architecture, Mandana throughout his works emphasized the diverse types of knowledge required for such an occupation. So he talks of mathematics and astral knowledge, along with the different types of media one must work in: metals, gems, stone, wood, and paint. That Mandana was interested in more than just buildings should not surprise us. On the very first page of his masterpiece, the Vastu Mandanam, the jewel of architecture, he puts his name into all of his writings. He cited a text, we're not dealing with modest people here, and we'll see more of that. He cited a text that was composed right here in Karnataka, the Manasolasa, or the Delight of the Mind, written by Chalukya king Someshwara III. This was a text that dramatically shifted the nature of writing about craft by focusing on a range of artisan activities, really the process, again, in addition to the product. So I'm going to take a slight detour here, and since we're in Karnataka, I'll talk about this for a little, but I'll return to Mandana in a few minutes, so just remember him and keep that on hold. To give you a taste of the source text, the Manasolasa, I'll go through how King Someshwara has described the lost wax casting method used to make metal statues. So casting bronze had long been a technique present here, but it's only with this text that we see a detailed description of the process, again, committed to writing. Right? So writing is being put to new uses here. Someshwara described the process in loving detail, talking of a skillful individual who constructs a wax statue in accordance with the prescribed measurements, remembering to leave a long tube in the shape of a datura flower made of wax on its back. Right, and so here's our datura flower funnel. The wax model is then covered in clay of a special formula 3 times over in a multi-stage process that takes 3 days, again, carried out, and I'm emphasizing this, this interest in knowledge by an intelligent man with skill and with care. Then this skillful person will have weighed at the outset, weighed the wax at the outset to determine the amount of bell metal, copper, silver, and gold required to fill the space left by the wax. So these are relative specific weights for the metals that are then provided. A crucible in the shape of a coconut should then be constructed around the metal, which after the wax of the statue has been heated and poured out of the mold, is then heated firmly and grasped with tongs and poured into the mouth of the funnel. At the end of the process, a person with skillful hands should break the burnt clay. There we go. So I go into this in some detail since it's a way of writing about matter, about material, about making that's quite novel, at least for Sanskrit. And because, as we saw the opening, this sort of crossing of theoretical and practical knowledge continues to be denied. And I should say that also this text, the Manasolasa, was widely copied and quoted in the early modern period, not just by Mandana. So we have copies now everywhere from Baroda to Tanjavur. There's also some in Lahore. So here I will take us back to Mandana. So no one should say that I don't keep my promises. Because as I was reading his Vastu Mandana, again written in about 1450 or 60, I stumbled across this passage which made me gasp and stop in my tracks. Among the weapons, there is the one with a barrel. Now, this sort of thing is not supposed to be in Vastu Shastras, which again are largely about different parts of stone buildings. So we can keep reading. If this were my class, I would ask for a volunteer to help me, but I'll leave you for now. So among fire weapons, there is one with a barrel, which releases bricks, wood, arrows, or stones. It's made of copper alloy or with much effort from wood. When it's made of iron, it's very strong and is praised, being joined with well-secured rings. It looks like a datura flower, but its length is between 3 to 6 times that. At its muzzle, it should be 2 times the size of the breech, or it can be 1.5 times. On the back, some people make a covering with a whorl of the conch shell. Some people make a clear impression at the site of the slit where the fire is applied. To start to unpack this briefly, so we see our old friend the datura flower raise its head again. And while this at first blush seems like an odd shape for a cannon, right, we usually think of cannons tapering towards the muzzle rather than flaring outwards. There was actually, in fact, a brief moment in the global history of firearms when cannons from Ming China to the Duchy of Burgundy did, in fact, look like this, or like this. Continuing the description, Mandana went on to explain how to use a cannon, once again providing instructions that only make sense when we know a little bit about 15th century cannons from other parts of Eurasia, and not after the 15th century. So the gunpowder, he uses the word here aushadha, or medicine for this, which is actually fairly common, should be placed in its breech in accordance with the measure of the barrel. Then a piece of wood that fits the barrel is firmly placed in front of the gunpowder. In the muzzle of the barrel, a ball of wood or wood joined with iron should be placed. When fire is applied to the slit in the back, the ball and everything else travels far, destroying things such as city walls and houses, villages and gardens. These fire weapons create terrible fear among enemy armies. They create victory for a king in various ways. The wise say they should be worshipped with cooked rice, wine, and meat. Now, I could talk about this passage for hours, and there are many details that draw the historian of technology's eye. For instance, the text curiously describes a wooden plug that's placed between the projectile and the gunpowder to serve as wadding, something that again was a common practice in the 15th century, but it went out of fashion with a new style of cannon that allowed for a tighter fit between projectile and the barrel. So there are also later passages here that describe the various sorts of gunpowder to be made, along with a smaller weapon that seems to be made out of bamboo. But for today, I want to focus on 2 big picture points about this passage and what it raises. The first is that until about 25 years ago, the conventional wisdom among historians was that firearms came to South Asia with the Portuguese in 1498 and with the Timurid Mughals in 1526. This timeline has been convincingly revised by Iqtidar Alam, who has expertly read Persian historical texts to argue that gunpowder was an aspect of warfare by the mid-15th century, and also revised by Richard Eden and Philip Wagner, who together have brought to light changes in fortress construction here in the Deccan in the mid-15th century that could only make sense to accommodate small pieces of artillery. But there are still many questions about the nature of these early weapons and knowledge about them. So Mandana's description of a range of cannons produced of bronze, iron, even wood, helps to show the speed with which artisans in South Asia took to both understanding and modifying these novel weapons. And here, just for fun, here we have a scene from a Lodi period Mahabharata, and it shows the Yadavas, I was supposed to go slowly, that's one quickly, defending Dwarka. And if you look closely, here's one cannon, and you can spot this other one. This is our datura-shaped cannon. So second, the passage draws our attention to the ways that practices moved in and out of texts and how textual knowledge circulated within artisan and architect communities. So this is not the Sanskrit that you read in school with its talk of worshiping canons with meat and alcohol, but it is Sanskrit nonetheless. And here we have someone who refers to himself as an architect using it to record technical information about the production and use of novel machines. And it's at this point that I want to turn to the larger metallurgical world that Sutradatta Mandana inhabited, and in particular to copper and its alloys, brass and bronze, which would have been by far the most common material used to make cannons in the 15th century. Now, Mandana is a bit of an elusive figure. The art historian Trina Lyon calls him, quote, a problematic presence in the history of late medieval architecture because despite his prolific output and his association with the king, his name is conspicuously absent from the many, many building projects that Kumbhakarna supported. It's hard to find direct traces of him in stone. But in the town of Javar, here, in a small complex that includes a temple dedicated to Vishnu and a small reservoir, an inscription echoes the colophons of Mandana's text and tells us that this complex was constructed in 1498 by his son, Ishvara. This was a moment of economic boom for the small town of Javar, situated in a rather arid portion of the Aravalli Mountains. In rapid succession, we can trace a series of stone temples, first Jain and then belonging to other faiths, spring up in the city. And this is because Javar is a mining town. And salvage archaeological investigations carried out in the early 1980s, initiated by prospecting from HCL Corporation, show that the area was home to silver and lead extraction from the ore, galena, argentiferous galena ore, in the mountains around the Aravalli Mountains around the town for a really long time. So fire-set mine shafts going back thousands of years were documented in a series of reports issued by a team led by Paul Craddock. What is more notable, however, at least for the purposes of this talk, is that these excavations also revealed the remnants of furnaces used for the smelting of zinc, sometimes still loaded with retorts after their final run. Carbon dating has placed these furnaces between the 14th and 17th centuries, exactly the period we're looking at. And this is notable because it is incredibly difficult to smelt zinc. This is a technological process previously believed to have been developed on an industrial scale in the 19th century. It's a multi-step process culminating in a complex reverse distillation procedure. In short, zinc is volatile. It has a low boiling point of about 900 degrees, and in its gaseous form, zinc quickly oxidizes to create what we colloquially call calamine. Is everyone with me? Doing a little bit of chemistry, not much. Tomorrow I'm going to make them do math. So to obtain metallic, so it becomes gaseous very quickly. When it vaporizes, it will almost immediately recombine with oxygen to create calamine. And to obtain metallic zinc, then, a chemical reaction is needed to remove this oxygen atom from calamine in an oxygen-deprived environment, so it doesn't reoxidize. This must be done across here a temperature gradient that allows for the gaseous zinc to become molten. So rushing out of here, become molten before collecting outside of the system as solid metallic zinc. To effect this at Javar and a few other sites across North India, people used retorts and furnaces, again, that look like this. Charcoal and calamine charges, along with a flux, usually borax, to act as a reducing agent, were placed in the body of a clay retort here, which was then fired from the top. careful managing of the temperature over a period of 8 to 10 hours, metallurgists tended the fire and created the conditions for this chemical reaction, and actually used retorts. Spent retorts were used are reused as building elements all over the landscape at Javar. Similar processes, interestingly, are alluded to in alchemical texts that probably go back to the 12th century. And by the 14th century, the ocean of mercury, the Rasa Rana Samuchaya, provides a detailed description that looks a lot like what has been found in the archaeological record. Describing the instruments used in alchemical procedures, the ocean of mercury presents a device it calls an aubergine crucible. This is an oblong retort with a 12-inch long tube with a top, again, like a datura flower. That is inserted it and used, as the text puts it, for extracting the essence of soft minerals such as calamine. So the essence of calamine is zinc. Again, right, we see our friend the datura used to describe one component of this technical device. And here in general is what is being described. Not that anyone needed a photograph of an aubergine. At another point, the text goes into further detail about how exactly to use the aubergine crucible for extracting metallic zinc. That is the essence of calamine. Calamine is pulverized and ground up together with lac, sugar, mustard, myrobalan, turmeric, sala resin, and borax. It's then roasted together with cow's milk and ghee and formed into balls which are placed inside the aubergine-shaped crucible. At this point, the metallurgist will turn to a special sort of furnace that is to be constructed around the crucible, and burying a vessel filled with water inside of a furnace, and a perforated vessel is then placed over it. Into the openings of this perforated vessel, a crucible is placed upside down. A fire is then lit above the crucible, and the essence of zinc flows out of the bottom. And turning to illustrated alchemical manuscripts, this, I think, is close to what is being described. I see it's gone a little blurry here. So there's a remarkable convergence here between the material remains from the archaeological site and the textual description of the process of extracting metallic zinc. But it's also worth dwelling on the differences. Alchemical texts present the practice as a largely solitary affair, carried out on a small scale. There's no sense there would ever be more than a single crucible managed at a given moment. But Javar provides a version of this operation scaled up to an industrial level, in which aubergine-shaped retorts were loaded by the dozen and fired simultaneously, providing annual zinc yields measured by the ton. Now, what good is metallic zinc? First of all, it is used in medicine. Calamine, as I've said, was widely used in the pre-modern world, much as it is used today. But calamine that is derived directly from the ore, that is without becoming metallic zinc first, will usually contain traces of sulfur and lead. Using metals as medicine can be dangerous. We get a sense of this danger from a notary named Kayasta Chamunda, who wrote a short manual on medical alchemy titled The Bud of the Signs of Mercury in 1474 while living in Javar. This is a thoroughly early modern text. It includes descriptions of what were then novel substances, opium and cannabis, and he reminds his readers in Javar of the danger of using improperly processed metallic substances in medicine. When they are purified and calcined, that combined with oxygen and stable, they are utilized and destroy all diseases. But the impure and inadequately processed ones that cause disease and death should be avoided. Chamunda was careful to note in his discussion of oxidized zinc that one use of the essence is derived, that one should use the calamine that is derived from the essence of it, that is zinc, and then recalcify it, recalcimate it. Yeah. So, of course, the other use of metallic zinc, and what drew me to these materials in the first place, is in making brass and other related copper alloys, often called bell metal and even sometimes called gunmetal. Now, you can make brass without metallic zinc. You use a blast furnace and a process called cementation, but if you do that, you cannot precisely control the zinc to copper content in the brass. And you cannot create an alloy with more than about 28% zinc in it. So the strength, brittleness, and malleability of the metal will largely be out of your control. Precise control of copper alloys is important for the construction of many things, say devices that can withstand high pressures, say of an explosion. And it's also important for making precision instruments. And in fact, a series of astrolabes produced in North India, and these are calculation devices that model the motion of the stars and the sun over the course of a day and a year, constitute the earliest evidence for the systematic use of high zinc brass. To make a precision astronomical instrument like this, an astrolabe, requires producing a series of millimeter-thin yet strong metal plates that are then inscribed, that's what's sitting underneath here, with complex mathematical curves. Increasing the zinc content of brass will alter the labor necessary to make these. So earlier, a brass plate, this is before this new zinc process, of about 1 centimeter in thickness was cast and then hammered into a 1 millimeter plate. But the problem is that this will create internal stresses within the crystalline structure of the alloy, making it brittle. To circumvent this, the metal would need to be heated again and again and again, and then rehammered in a process known as annealing. And this will then recrystallize the internal structure of the alloy. And again, this process of heating, hammering, heating, again, hammering again, would have to be repeated over and over and over. It's a labor-intensive effort. However, brass with a higher zinc content can be hot worked directly. That is, it can be heated and hammered into the desired thickness in one step, eliminating the need for repetitive annealing. And indeed, such a process is alluded to in the Persian Aini Akbari, composed in the Mughal court at the end of the 16th century, when the court chronicler Abul Fazl says that brass, which the Indians call pittal, is made in 3 ways. First, there's a low zinc content kind, 2.5 seres of copper to 1 ser of the essence of calamine. Right, again, calamine is zinc oxide. Its essence in alchemical terms will be metallic zinc. This is malleable when cold. Secondly, if you increase the zinc content, 2 seres of copper to 1 ser of the essence of calamine, this is malleable when heated. And thirdly, you can also cast it. So this passage demonstrates direct co-melting of metallic copper and zinc was commonplace by the 16th century, and different combinations of these metals were used for working brass in different ways, with the zinc content above the limit of the cementation process being used for hot working the alloy. So whether it was the creation of hardened plates or in making precise engravings, high zinc content brass proved ideal in the workshop for crafting precision astronomical instruments. I've so far introduced you to a rather diverse cast of characters. We've seen the precocious coppersmith Palhana, the down-to-earth South Indian king Someshwara, the mechanically inclined architect Mandana, and a couple of alchemists interested in metallurgy, also in opium. And then we've just seen the notary Chamunda. Each one of these individuals inhabited a different social position. And in this final section of my talk, I want to turn to the question, what did it mean to be a coppersmith in early modern South Asia? And I will try and answer it by telling a story from within the coppersmith community. In the world that I'm tracing, that is early modern India, to be a coppersmith was to be cursed. Indeed, it was to be cursed 2 times over. To explain what I mean by this, I will turn to a mythological genealogy called the Sri Kalika Puranam. While little known today, indeed, there has been no academic writing on it to date, and while difficult to date precisely, the history of the goddess Kalika fits into a textual model that was on the rise in the early modern period. These are additions to Sanskrit mythological texts that describe the origins, practices, and beliefs of particular caste communities. These accounts are not merely stories, they're also legal documents used to make social and political claims. In the early modern period, texts such as this one that I will talk about found an expanded social and juridical role, and control over the production of such stories and texts from them, written artifacts, was a vital means of securing rights and identities for rulers as much as their humbler subjects. So what's particularly interesting about this story, the Sri Kalika Puranam, is that it emerged not from a privileged community, but rather from a community of artisans, of coppersmiths from Western India. And the whole text is in fact a meditation on the social position of this particular community and what it means for a group of people to be connected with, indeed defined by a metal, pure copper and its alloys. So as we have it now, the text is known through 2 manuscripts, one from Visnagar and one from Nasik. There's actually an additional manuscript of a closely related but slightly different Sanskrit text in London. Here's what it looks like. And interestingly, and for another time, there is a Kannada poem from 1520 that narrates exactly the same story. And if I'm invited back again next year, I will tell you about that. So the story opens up in Ujjain. Slide is not, there we go. There's Ujjain. Okay, so the story opens in the nearby city of Ujjain. There, in a temple of the goddess, in fact, this temple, religious rituals are performed by coppersmiths on the new moon day of the month Ashada. The main narrator notes that he has traveled all over the world and nowhere has he observed rituals performed at this normally inauspicious moment. A back and forth dialogue ensues about this strange fact and frames the intervention of the text. Who is this goddess Mahakali? Who are these people whose livelihood is bronze? One participant in the question and answer dialogue asks, why are religious rituals performed by Kansaras, that is this particular coppersmith community, on the new moon day of the month of Ashada, and not by other people? And how is it that these people who live as coppersmiths, they earn money as merchants, and yet they have a royal lineage? To answer these questions, the text re-narrates one of the most famous stories from Hindu mythology, that of Parashu Rama. Right? This is a well-known, rather violent story, and I don't think I have to get into the full narrative here, but 2 things just to keep in mind as I keep talking regarding the standard version. The first is that Parashu Rama, right here, is a Brahmin warrior who, owing to a variety of circumstances, engages in the wholesale slaughter of Kshatriyas, annihilating them from the face of the earth. The second thing to keep in mind, so that's about the story, and this is a historical fact, is that this story was historically taken up as a foundation myth for several privileged communities along the western littoral of India. So from Malabar up through the Konkan coast, communities linked their presence to the need for repopulating the area following Parashu Rama's killing spree. What's interesting about the early modern coppersmith text that I've been discussing is that it tells a version of the story from the other side, that is, from the perspective of the victims of the divine warrior Parashu Rama. The narrative opens with four unfortunate souls living as semi-divine beings. These four were irresponsibly driving their chariots, their cars around one day, making a ruckus with their bells when they disrupted the meditation of a sage. Perturbed, the sage declared that these haughty beings with complete pleasure, who were disrupting Brahmins with their chariots, had made him deaf with the noise of their bells. Upset that his knowledge had been disrupted, the sage cursed the four beings to spend their times making bells, right? Because they're making all this noise. You all shall take on human form as coppersmiths, and living through bronze, and your work will be the alloy bronze. This, I should say, is maybe a tad bit of an overreaction. And the sage, seeing the fear of being human that gripped the four, he modified his curse a little bit. If they engaged in metallurgy and made sales fairly, relying on well-balanced and just scales to set the prices, then though God's kings and royal servants will oppress you, the sage stated, the goddess Vajrakali will be your constant companion. So this is the first curse, which leads to the second curse and brings us back to Parashurama. You see, these four beings were reincarnated in the wombs of the soon-to-be widows of this poor fellow, Kartavirya Arjuna. And unlike in other versions of the story, four of his wives survive. And they're exiled to the city of Haridwar in the foothills of the Himalayas on the condition that they raise their children as merchants, not as warriors. So the four sons grow up in Haridwar. They eventually ask their mothers the story of their lineage. Upon hearing it, the sons grew incensed. They vowed to kill Parashurama. They go up to the Himalayas, where they eventually approach the god Shiva, aiming to make a request from him. But hearing their approach, Parashurama requests Saraswati to corrupt their speech. So when they try and request for victory in our arrows, they instead ask for commerce. That's an okay pun. So this is the second curse, right? The one that enacts the promise of the first one. Again, pitying these former princes, the god Shiva tells the four that they will live as coppersmiths, and what's more, since this profession is divinely bestowed, they don't have to pay taxes. For her part, the goddess also promises them protection as they labor. So the god Vishwakarma then appears in order to teach them the profession, together with its mantras, its tools, and the way of the weighing scale. The text provides a list of technical terminology for the tools used in the profession that is heavily vernacularized, and it even includes two words derived from Persian. I've not really seen anything like this before. It's real shop talk. Having learned to make merchandise in a range of media, from gold to bronze to glass, the four then pack up their goods on camels and head south, reaching the city of Kanchipuram. It's there that they set up shop, displaying their products in good order for the sake of commerce, and making sure, of course, to set fair prices, as had been stipulated by the god Vishwakarma. The princess of Kanchi soon caught word of their wonderful mirrors, actually, and planned a visit to the market. And picking up a polished mirror made by our heroes, the princess went off on her palanquin without paying. So the brothers then run in front of the palanquin. They angrily seize the mirror from the hands of the princess. Shocked, the princess proclaimed that the mirror was hers according to her right to extract tribute from her subjects. The four brothers retorted that they have a divine right to work without fear of taxes. Our living through trade amongst merchants, they state, was prescribed by the god Shiva, and it is to be born without having to provide taxes. You may be the daughter of such a king as rules over all creatures, but even he is unfit for us, who are engaged in the livelihood of bell metal. Go, lady, to your house and tell that to the king. So while valiant, this is probably an unwise thing to say to a princess. She promptly told her father, who sent soldiers out against our heroes. They managed to fend off several waves of attack, but were eventually captured by deceit, One by one, they were brought to the four gates of the city, and one by one, they were crushed to death by elephants. Pay the tax, the king's men said over and again. Pay the tax, great fool, if you wish to live. They said to one of the ill-fated brothers, who replied, the king seeks tax, neglecting the proper path. He is a fool. Who is able to transgress that proper path that has been laid out by God before he's crushed to death by an elephant? To make a long story short, 3 of the brothers are killed, 1 survives. The goddess fulfills her promise and saves the final one, who ends up, in fact, marrying the princess. They head back north to Haridwar together to inform the mothers of the event. And upon hearing the news of the death of the 3 sons, the mothers all die on the spot. And with no reason to stay in Haridwar, they leave. And they move to Ujjain and establish a community there. So this answers the questions with which the text opens. And the narrative goes on to state that further descendants of the surviving coppersmith prince settled across South Asia from Gujarat to Bengal and Andhra and here in Karnataka. Everywhere they went, they all became coppersmiths. And wherever they settled, they acted in accordance with the customs of the place. Again, I mentioned there's a Karnataka part of this story, but for another occasion. So the past 45 minutes or so have been a rather brisk jaunt through the history of technology, or rather one aspect of the history of technology in early modern South Asia. We saw architects writing about cannons, rulers writing about bronze casting, physicians writing about zinc smelting, along with some beautiful astrolabes. And now that we've reached the end, I would like to return to the 3 questions with which I opened. Who is included in the stories we tell about technology and its history? What sources do we use for our stories? And why should anyone care? I hope by now it's clear that we can tell histories about a much wider array of technical actors than some would admit. Indeed, a full history of technology would have to be a history of technology full of people. To tell such a story, and why I have put so many slides up, it's important to cast a wide net in terms of sources, from archaeological remains to museum pieces, architectural manuals to Puranas. All the while, I've been trying to show you my method without overstepping, making precise claims relying on sources that I have made clear to you, without overstepping, I hope, what the evidence will bear. One interesting thing to come of this is a fact about the written word itself. It was much more prevalent in the past than we often presume. Finally, why should anybody care? This is a much more difficult question to answer. But in a world in which technology seems increasingly to control our lives and to take agency away from us faster and faster each day, it's important, I think, to slow down, to pause, and make sense of pasts in which different socio-technical imaginaries, that is, different ways of imagining our relation to the world around us, mediated through the objects we use to shape it, could flourish. These pasts, I think, will not always show us better ways to live, but they will show us that our current way of being in the world is not a foregone conclusion. Thank you so much for listening to me tonight. I'm really looking forward to continuing the conversation. So, yeah. I think there's 2 roving microphones. Well, there's one up here.
What a wonderful, exciting talk. It was just so beautiful. Thank you so much. I'm going to speak about Karnataka because this is where I'm more familiar with. So in Anegundi, which is not so far away from here, I'm sure you know about it, they're inscriptions that potter communities write, which take the Amrita Mantana, the turning of the ocean, and the actor, the protagonist, is the pot. not the god, not the snake, but the pot. So what's really interesting to me about these stories is how different communities pick them up and arc them towards themselves. And why we should care is because as a person who teaches students who come from different communities, castes, many of whom come from artisanal castes, they don't know how to deal with those histories. They only know abjection, many of them. They only know how to devalue it. They only know the history of devaluation. But these stories, which are show them traveling all over South Asia, all over, everywhere, and knowing so much, writing, Sanskrit, Prakrit, Rajasthani, whatever you want to call it, Kannada. There was so much knowledge, and it's important. What you're doing is very, very important.
Thank you. And yeah, that mobility is so much written into these stories, and something I didn't bring out fully this evening, but it's there. So thank you for that. Anegun, where did he say it was? Anegun.
Hi, great talk. Just a quick question. To what degree are the stories told by these coppersmiths, um, are they accepted by other people? Or is it seen as sort of like self-indulgent, masturbatory kind of storytelling? Um, do other people accept this kind of lineage and description of themselves, or is it just for their community as sort of, like I said, self-indulgent?
That's a really good question, and I don't know the full. I have not been able to reconstruct a full reception history of this. Although, since we know this story was at least being told in 1520, I will say that if you go through the sort of the really old and like pretty messed up like colonial ethnographic, often um, inflected by eugenics, uh, uh, books about caste and tribes is usually actually races and tribes as they're described in the. We see people from these communities actually over and over again coming forward to colonial census takers and telling them the story of Parashurama and parts of it. Um, and I would like to sort of read those texts against the grain and see people from artisanal communities, again, coming forward with these stories and narrating them to the new government taking the decennial census.
Um, Sorry for the follow-up question, but to what degree did these communities have to integrate within larger merchant guilds like the 500, or uh, was were they independent? Was there some kind of like were there subcontracts? How did that work exactly?
I don't know the answer to that yet. I wish I did. I will say one thing that I found interesting and was surprising in this is, I mean, this text is all about copper and bronze, and but it is very emphatic that they also work in other media, um, especially glass. I would suspect making bangles. And gold. And so there is this sense that while this community is defined by one metal, it doesn't fully constrain them.
The process of making brass or bronze, you showed a document which is from the 15th century. Is there no evidence much earlier than that of this, or have you have restricted your research only into that period? Was it much earlier, and if so, how many years earlier?
Yeah, so brass, here I'm focusing on brass, right, which is copper and zinc alloyed. Brass can be made without directly co-melting the two metals. Um, if you put copper and then the ore directly in the furnace together, particles of gaseous zinc will seep into the copper. So there's brass long before this. But this high zinc content brass and this ability to control proportions of metals so precisely, that's what's novel.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eric. I echo everybody's enthusiasm. It's just, I'm in awe of the number of sources that you're able to bring together to tell this history. And I was wondering, and I know this is very much research in progress, but I was wondering if you've had an opportunity to interview or work with or have conversations with any practicing coppersmiths, or if in Ujjain this community still performs these rituals, just to kind of get a sense that how is this history living and what kind of against the grain or with the grain or reconstitution that is happening, and in that what geographies come up. One was that, and the second means I'll and we can talk about that later. I'm like absolutely amazed with how you use the material and the making to think how, in some ways, how military architecture as well as the material that makes defense possible, power possible, like how do you shift that narrative to the maker? And I was wondering that in this context of the Aravalis, where this metal is being mined, then is there further discussion of the kind of professions that are possible? And I'm thinking with people, say, of the utensil maker. Is that something, is that that is one of the professions? Does that come up in any kind of hierarchy? In other words, like, is the pittal maker also kind of associated with other professions where then there is another fine-grained kind of question of sociality, caste, skill, how is that valued? And the, I'm asking because in a lot of the depictions of bazaars in the kind of painted invitation letters that I see, you have a real provenance of the utensil maker, and I'm keen to look at that with at that material with you to think if that ties into this history or not.
Yeah, I think one thing I didn't stress, but at least this last text is very emphatic that the coppersmiths are not only making, but they're some sort of merchant capitalist group. That they are, it's very much about selling. They go to Kanchi not because Kanchi has a great bronze casting tradition, which it does, but to actually sell. And that's what's driving them. And that actually appears over and over again. That's what their main describes all sorts of tools, but the tool mentioned over and over is the weighing scale. So there's that aspect. To get to the first question, I don't know if he came. Did Yatin Nagesh come? Oh, hello. We were in your copper studio, in your bronze studio, a couple days ago. So thank you for coming, and I already have learned a lot from you. Amazing bronze caster artist from many generations of specialties.
Okay, Eric, I had so many questions from little bits of the text you cited that you didn't talk about, but that is for later. So I'm going to confine myself to two questions. One is about the Sri Karika Puranam and this whole context. I think that the context of why a certain assertion of relationship to a goddess, relationship to a geography, and a certain kind of assertion of scale of activities is required. And I tend to, my understanding of Jati Puranas is that they emerge at times when the state asks them. Are there any resources within the Kalika Puranam which give you a sense of what was the moment or crisis that you think that text might be responding to, and what kind of geography that might belong to? So that's question one. And the other is about, of course, the astrolabes. And this incredible, kind of historicizing that you are making available, that it is only with the availability of zinc and the kind of the technical ability to use that a certain kind of fineness of astrolabe plates becomes possible. So here's where again I just wanted a little more contextualizing of, we've got the 14th century Yantra Raja text, we've got then the 16th and 17th century Lahore family of astrolabe and armillary sphere makers. So between those periods, what are the actual technological changes that one might see between, and again, we kind of stay within that Western Indian zone, but I'm kind of thinking also of the relationship of the Jain assayers and so on to the Delhi Sultans, to the Gujarat Sultans, and whether assaying and the whole question of the purity and the percentages of metal within alloys, what are the kind of key changes in the nature of that knowledge, if it's possible at all?
Yeah, and I mean, I'll just again start from the end, and it's hard to say. There's only been one real study of the composition of astrolabes from the Adler Planetarium in Chicago, actually. They got several papers out of the one study, but of these. So I think work needs to be done on a much larger scale to survey them with XRF technology. I'll have to think more. I mean, as you know, I've been reading a lot of practical mathematical texts, and I think that is one theme that carries on throughout. And in my writing about literacy, I very much want to bring numeracy into the question, and it, I think, again, much more prevalent than we would assume, or than is normally assumed. For the Sri Kalika Puranam, it's about Ujjain. The language is, it's Sanskrit, but when it gets into the particular technical phrases, it's from the Northwest. It's about taxes over and over again. So I think that might have something to do with it. And actually, to connect your question with the initial one from the back, there's another text I've been reading called the Ratakara-Adhikaranam, which is about the authority of Ratakaras. And it's a compilation made within the Vishwakarma community to establish a particular status. And it does a lot of Sanskrit philosophy. And that's actually where I have seen the Jati Puranas mobilized and brought in. So that's the Nagara Kanda of the Nagara Kanda of the Kumara Purana. That is sort of brought into it, and there's a mention actually of a Twashtar Purana also in that. So that's where I have seen them started to be mobilized in that way as actual legal documents.
Artisans biased inscription talking about what happens if, like, about like the purity of metal, how it's healthy, it's pure, but then it's pure in bad food. So I'm just interested in this idea of like, because actually zinc that much anyway is pure king, right? So like, so this idea of, did many of them consider that the more purer the process, the better it is for healthiness? And is that something that you see in connection with technology and with health in other texts?
Yeah, so absolutely. That is throughout alchemical texts, and what I'm calling alchemical texts are medical texts, largely medical texts that use metals as medicine, and they are very concerned with that purity question. And the authors know that things can go bad. I'll end with one more story actually that maybe also answers part of Samira's question from the Srikalika Puranam, which is that actually after all of his three brothers have been killed, the one remaining, his name is Dhamapala, he asks the goddess, what went wrong? Why were all of them not saved? And she says it's because they were actually mixing. The word is they use this rasa bheda, and I think it means, I mean, it's clear that it means improper alloying and unfair alloying. And actually, another part of the story was about the Purana is about the goddess killing the two demons, Chanda and Munda, which especially becomes named Chamundi. And actually, those two demons are actually at the end resurrected, and they are the ones who will do the smelting. So this community sort of separates it from the direct smelting and alloying, and it's given to those. So yeah, we see also then that hierarchization of craft communities.
Thank you so much for that fascinating talk on socio-technical imaginaries. I just had a quick question. I'm curious about whether your book has something on medicine as well, because I know you're a historian of medicine as well. So I'm just curious about that, and if you could just give me a sense of what the book will have in terms from medicine.
Yeah, this material will actually not be in the book, in the first book. This is in a series of articles that will then lead up to the second book. There is medicine in my first book, and actually a lot about medical debates about how scholars and physicians come together to debate the foundations of medicine. And that book will be out in March, I hope. Thank you for being such a generous audience.
Thank you, Eric, for that fascinating talk. We would also like to thank NGMA and the technical team and Darshan and all for collaborating with us and giving us this beautiful auditorium. And of course, you, the audience, for coming on a Saturday evening in spite of a rain threat. I'd also like to acknowledge the presence of Halmitra Patel, who's been an INTAC member, and at this age, she comes all the way, and then she's so interested in these kind of talks, and I think she's a chemical engineer herself, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. Metallurgy, wow, okay. Yeah, thank you all. Enjoy the rest of the weekend, and good night. Yeah, 1 second.
So we have a small token from our souvenir shop. I would like Ms. Meera to come on stage and Mr. Eric